All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined tonight, not for the first or even second time, but for the first time in quite a while by Gordon Katic. How are you doing?
I'm great, Ben. How are you? Good to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is going to be a little bit of a shorter one than usual, but should be pretty interesting. This is Piers Morgan and former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett talking about Gaza, of course. So this is, like we have done, sometimes on here we'll do things that are from, a few years ago or, from firing line episodes from 1965, right? But this is very recent. So yeah, I thought this would be an interesting one to.
Is this yesterday or the day before? Like
Yeah,
this week, right?
Yeah, it is. Let me see. Actually, this is from 3 days ago. It says
The right-wing Israeli press loves this debate, and then you just Google it on, and you see various YouTube channels from right-wingers like saying things like "absolute mayhem" as Piers Morgan gets educated, all caps. So we should be in for a wild ride.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I am looking forward to that. So, with no further ado, let's start this out.
The war in Gaza has become one of the most divisive issues of our times. Legitimate criticism of Israel has metastasized into a surge in anti-Semitism. Pro-Palestine protesters in cities across the world have chanted from the river to the sea, which self-evidently calls for the eradication of Israel. Some have used it.
Yeah, so this is pretty amazing that this is of course this is going to be, Piers is obviously arguing with Naftali Bennett, from way to Bennett's left, but within the first 16 seconds, we've gotten this claim about criticism of Israel metastasizing into anti-Semitism, which I think is pretty absurd. It's a not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist, of course, or that that there aren't that you can't find instances if you're looking for them of those two streams crossing. That'd be a silly thing to deny, but the idea that that's like that, that there's any significant percentage of cases where that's true, I think is just kind of absurd.
Yeah, when you sent me this video, I watched like the first 10 seconds just to get a kind of taste of what I was in for. And I thought it was about anti-Semitism on the left. And then I looked at the actual description and I realized it's not. And then I realized, oh, even to do like any sort of mild-mannered criticism of the most far-right Israeli politician, you have to first punch left really hard to justify it. It's really just, it's pathetic.
Yeah, exactly. And the river to the sea thing, I think, is even worse. That it's not at all self-evident that that's what that means, right? If you, because it's, if you were chanting "eradicate Israelis from the river to the sea," then yes, that would be self-evident that that's what it meant. But here you're saying "free Palestine from the river to the sea," so this is. This is saying that you want something to happen from the river to the sea that is unlike the present in a sense that you'd think that, would be freedom for Palestinians, but that's not, it's not all the obvious interpretation of that. Right. Like, and there are certainly, there could be people who mean, who have, who mean things that, we wouldn't like or agree with, by it. But the obvious meaning, and certainly the meaning that in the overwhelming majority of cases, at least when you're talking about Western anti-war protests, they, would have a single democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for everybody. And it's just kind of amazing that like this is, I don't know, it's like I keep thinking of the old Simpsons bit when they're in Australia and Marge keeps trying to order coffee and they keep interpreting her as ordering beer. Freedom, right? oh, genocide? You're saying genocide?
Yeah, I mean, nobody ever bothers the people who supposedly interpret this as a call to genocide, goes out and actually asks people, what do you mean when you say that? Like, it's a bad faith reinterpretation of what clearly like peace activists desire. It's really frustrating.
Yeah. All right. Did not want to let this go by without saying that, but we could watch a bit more.
Excesses of the Israeli government as a fig leaf for abusing Jewish people, many of whom say they're simply no longer feeling safe. But the ugliness and division is flowing in both directions. In Britain, anti-Muslim hate cases have more than tripled since the October 7th attacks. Horror about the attacks has emboldened prejudiced people to let their vitriol pour. And we seem to have collectively forgotten what racism actually is and what it looks like. MP Lee Anderson, who until recently was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, accused the Muslim mayor of London of being controlled by Islamists.
I don't actually believe that these Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is they've got control of Caen, and they've got control of London, and they've got control of Storm as well.
If you have any difficulty understanding why those comments are deeply offensive, try flipping the subject. Imagine London had a Jewish mayor and a senior politician in the government said, I believe the Jews have control of the mayor and the Jews have control of London. That wouldn't be tolerated, and rightly so. Anderson's now being suspended. He still refuses to publicly apologise. But a cavalcade of his colleagues, including the Prime Minister, have repeatedly failed to describe his comments as racist. But they were racist. And if you don't agree, consider that it might be because, maybe you don't understand what racism is. Lee Anderson's idiotic comments have overshadowed a much bigger issue for British democracy, which made global headlines last week. A parliamentary debate on a ceasefire in Gaza was disrupted in defiance of all convention over concerns that MPs voting against it would be attacked. The British Parliament ceased to operate by its own rules to prevent its elected officials from being threatened, abused, or even killed by Islamist extremists. That sets a chilling and dangerous precedent. If politicians cave into intimidation and threats, as they did last week, the obvious result will be more intimidation and more threats. And if our society tolerates slurs and racism like the bills spewed by the likes of Lee Anderson, the obvious result will be more slurs and more racism. The only way to deal with all this is by facing up to the reality of extremism on both sides and for all decent people to reject it. The issue British MPs should have been debating freely and openly is the urgent question of whether it's time for Israel's allies to call for an end to this war. Prime Minister Netanyahu again says no amount of pressure will stop him.
Our brave soldiers proved them all wrong on all counts. Many also argued that Israel's military campaign would scuttle our ability to release the hostages. Well, they were wrong on this one too. Military pressure led to the release of 110 hostages, and only continued military pressure will bring home the remaining hostages.
Well, I've said repeatedly that Israel had both the right and a duty to respond with force to the October 7th attacks. But Netanyahu keeps pushing the boundaries. Every time he does, many more thousands of innocent Palestinians die in the process. After 4.5 months of failing to say what will happen to Gaza after the war, the Prime Minister has now published an insultingly short one-page plan. It says that if and when Hamas is eradicated, Gaza will be controlled by local officials with administrative experience, provided they have no connections to Hamas. Well, given that Hamas has run Gaza since 2006, exactly who those local administrators are is unclear. If Israel can't find anybody it deems suitable, Israel will remain in control. And frankly, that looks like a blueprint for continued occupation. And that will only manufacture more of the radicalization that sparked this deadly war in the first place. Well, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, so I guess before we start to watch the thing itself, we got that opening monologue, which, as you noted, started with some, I think really over the top left punching that, any anti-war protester who, chants from the river to the sea that Palestine will be free is calling for genocide, even though anybody who's actually been to a protest knows that there's, any protest of any significant size right? There's always like a large invisible contingent of people with, like Jews for Peace and things like that, signs, who are presumably, I think a moment's reflection would tell you are probably not calling for genocide against Jews when they chant things like that, and the sort of more general claim about anti-Semitism. And then we got into the rest of that was just sort of standard kind of middle of the road Western commentary on the war in Gaza, which is to say that the line is like, well, it's basically fine, but this Netanyahu guy, this seems a little sketchy, and maybe he's gone too far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much of the oxygen here is around like discourse policing and like who is made to feel like safe and who is made to feel upset, sort of like on both sides. And some of that is reasonable, some of that is sort of fantastical. But I think it's all kind of a waste of time in the grand scheme of like the actual issues that are at stake here. And maybe it's a little different in the US media. I mean, people may know, Ben, I'm Canadian, and like here in the Canadian media, that's 99% of Israel-Palestine coverage, because even though we're an Israeli ally, we're even less important in real sort of geostrategic terms and military aid terms, policy terms. So it's like, how do people feel after seeing a protest? That's like the extent of the news.
Yeah, it's probably slightly less here, but still quite a bit. I mean, we had actual congressional hearings about Harvard students who said they felt unsafe, and it is obviously in some in some cases there's like some of the stuff he's talking about is like genuinely like racist or disturbing comments, but like it's still like I really like what you said there, because it's like okay, I think that like I think nearly all I feel so unsafe claims are a little hyperbolic, but like also even the ones that aren't that much, it's like, I don't know. I mean, we just had like, there were literally just like in this morning's news, there's a, massacre of, over 100 Palestinians who were killed while waiting for like aid, aid trucks to give them food, and several hundred who were injured. And if you believe the IDF story about this, it's just that the people who they were deliberately starving as a weapon of war. There are numerous statements from Israeli politicians, saying that that's exactly what they're doing. It's just that, when there's, a desperate chance of getting a scrap of food, that, people started to stampede, and then like Israeli soldiers, killed some of them. If you don't really believe the IDF story, because they haven't done a whole lot to earn anybody's trust on issues like this lately, then maybe a lot of them were killed by the IDF directly, and maybe that's why the stampede started. But regardless, right, of what you think happened in that instance, I mean, that when that's the underlying issue is one where things like that are happening. The sort of question of whether people living in comfort at universities for rich kids feel psychologically unsafe in their heads. It's maybe not the thing that should be the most important issue.
Yeah, that's such a good point. You'd think of all the times an actual war, not really a war, more of a genocide, would make you think, you know what, I'm going to have some perspective here and care a little bit less about how I feel in the classroom and a little bit more about these children that are dying, perhaps. But no, we actually sort of buckled down.
Yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, I think that he's sort of and I also think that like the whole, the way that you perform moderation in context like this monologue by saying, okay, well, basically the Israeli state is fine. It's just, Netanyahu is bad, is sort of really detached from the larger realities of Israeli politics, that this is that, the sort of main opposition doesn't actually oppose the main lines of what has happened. I mean, that Netanyahu might be like a particularly extreme and inflammatory, figure, but there really isn't a lot of apparent distance, between the main factions on that, and and just beyond that, like that. Okay, so it even before October 7th and the current, war, or whatever word you think is more appropriate than war to describe what's going on, it's, we're also talking about, 56 years in which you have millions of people who've been subjects but not citizens of a state that, would like definitely never let them have citizenship in that state, because that, because that would disturb the ethnic demographics, and and it would, and like even the hope of some kind of miserable partition that, I think we've seen how that plays out in other parts of the world, so it's not a great option, but that, would let people be citizens of something, is something that, just has seemed for a very long time very hard to imagine, right? And that's not, that's not something that's like, oh, if Netanyahu had a heart attack tomorrow, right, would change the day after tomorrow, right? So it's like, but it's, you sort of can't say any of that and be Piers Morgan. Like that's, you could say, oh, Netanyahu's gone too far, right, as an individual decision maker, and still be Piers Morgan. But I don't think you can sit in the seat that he's sitting in and say anything that goes much beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, he's rude. He says the quiet part out loud. I think of it Netanyahu in the same way that I think in terms of like for kind of centrist liberals, he's a kind of like Trump-like figure in the sense that he's a great kind of excuse to avoid the rot at the center of Israeli politics, just like Trump is as an excuse to avoid the rot at the center of American politics, and just say, oh, it's this kind of like outlier sort of gauche guy who's upsetting our norms. But like to your point, this is how many years now of occupation? It's there've been doves and there've been hawks, and it's all been the same. The rhetoric's been different, but the overriding policy is the same.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like Israel was expanding settlements in the West Bank during the during the years that the Oslo peace process was theoretically an ongoing thing. Yeah, no, I like the comparison to Trump. I mean, I always think of Masha Gessen, who is a good sort of intuition check on this, right? Because she's somebody who I think can't be reasonably suspected of Putin apologetics, right? That she had to leave Russia, because she's a gay and a dissident and all this stuff. And I remember several years ago her having this great video about how the liberal obsession with Russiagate seemed to her to be about like finding a way to frame Donald Trump as this foreign intrusion into American society and not a product of that society, right? That which seems exactly right. It's like, yeah, look, I mean, this somebody like Trump is, it doesn't like we're a society that would like in which somebody like Trump could rise to that level, it's and you could have only gotten Trump when you have like among other things, right? I mean, when he was running the first time in 2016, right? He was talking about a Muslim ban. That was like his big thing. And it's like, well, could you have had that without the last several years of, fear mongering about neo-Muslims from neocons, kind of preparing the way for it, right? And similarly, Netanyahu is, he's like a sort of particularly noxious figure, but there's a particular kind of society on a particular trajectory that, in which you get somebody like Netanyahu, being prime minister for a very long time and having the solid loyalty of a big chunk of it. And it's just, it really doesn't seem like you can say anything real about this unless you start out by acknowledging that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add on the Masha Gessen point. If I remember correctly, and I was just looking it up, they had a talk postponed or might have even been canceled in Berlin for the Hannah Arendt Prize because they had the temerity to compare Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto. So speaking of discourse policing, another kind of victim of someone having a kind of critique of Israeli politics getting silenced.
Yeah.
Israel joins me now. Mr. Bennett, thank you very much indeed for coming back on the program. When we last spoke,
good to be here.
It was only about 3 weeks after the horrors of October the 7th. And you said in terms of Israel's response, it isn't about the numbers, deaths, it's about how we, Israel, get them, Hamas, out. Are you comfortable with how the war has been prosecuted since then?
The IDF is performing exceptionally well under the toughest circumstances in any war that I can recall, because we could have finished this war in 3 days if we were cavalier about civilian lives. But we're not. We care. And we do everything we can to prevent unnecessarily deaths of civilians. That's why it's taking time. It's going to take a few more months, but we are on track to remove Hamas from Gaza.
I mean, it's a bold statement to say you'll do that. Many people say that if you try and eliminate Hamas completely, then many tens or maybe hundreds of thousands more Palestinians will be killed and wounded in that process. And how is that going to stop future radicalization? Are you not just stirring up a massive problem for yourselves going forward?
No, quite the contrary. What we've learned from history is that when you are working with very radical ideologies, you first have to win, and then you can start recovering and rebuilding. You couldn't start the recovery of Germany without first bringing Germany or the Nazis to total surrender. Likewise here, we have to defeat Hamas, and then we can start the process of recovery.
How will you know when you've beaten Hamas?
When they come out and surrender with white flags, or we've killed them.
Why would they surrender? They've shown no sign of doing that.
No, there's quite hundreds already that have surrendered, perhaps already thousands, because when you know the army is closing on you and now they're hunkered down underground in Rafa and hiding behind women and children, but it is closing on them, and they'll know. And as we've seen in other places, when they know that their death is imminent, they come out and surrender.
If thousands of Hamas have surrendered, where are they?
We've already interrogated over a couple of thousand of Hamas operatives, and yeah, that's what we do. They're in our custody.
Where are they in custody?
Great question.
In all kinds of places in Israel, in the Negev. Some of them are in Gaza. We prefer logistically to do it within Gaza, and then we move on.
But just to be clear, you're saying that thousands of Hamas terrorists have surrendered to the IDF and are being held in custody and being interrogated?
We've interrogated, I believe, over 3,000 operatives in varying degrees of involvement. Some are military Hamas, some are civilian Hamas, and we've learned a lot from that. That's another source
civilian
of
Hamas.
Our being able
Palestinian.
to close on the leadership of Hamas.
What is a civilian Hamas? I mean, aren't they all terrorists?
Hamas has a civilian arm of governing Gaza and a military arm of conducting terror against Israel. You are right that they are intertwined, much like the Nazis. During the Nazi regime, there were also Nazi teachers, Nazi officials that dealt with Germany, but there were also the Nazis that conducted the Holocaust, the Shoah, and World War II. It's a government. Piers, I want to be very clear. Hamas has been governing Gaza for the past 15 years.
Yeah, no, I'm obviously aware of that. I think the point of concern for the global community that's been mounting, as you're well aware, is that it's now been reported that as many as 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, with another 70,000 injured. This is out of a population of just 2 million, of whom half of them are children under 18. And again, it comes back to what is proportionate. You know, I understand Israel's desire to want to get rid of Hamas, but at what cost? You know, the sheer scale of the deaths of young, innocent Palestinians must be of great concern to you, isn't it?
Yeah, we are concerned with unnecessary or deaths, first of our own people and then also of citizens. But these deaths, I wouldn't call them unnecessary. I would call them collateral damage that is part of war. And I have to say that in Israel's case, we're conducting war at one of the lowest ratios of collateral damage. I believe roughly 2.5 versus every terrorist. Compared to 6, 7, 8, and 9 in other wars. Look, there's no.
Yeah, so I wrote an article for the Daily Beast when Alan Dershowitz wrote his big article responding to the genocide case against Israel in the ICJ. And, you know, as far as I could tell, right, he's using the Dershowitz number is the same one that Naftali Bennett is using. Actually, it might be slightly different, but it's in the neighborhood of the same one. And nobody I've seen give that number has like given the slightest hint about where they got it from, right? I mean, that this is you know, why? I mean, even if you believe for this, you know, even if you do believe that, you know, I mean, I think if you're really talking about like, you know, if you've killed multiple innocent civilians, you know, for every fighter that you've killed, I think that'd be horrifying regardless. But but like these numbers, right? Oh, it's only like a couple, right? That's
what exactly is their made up number? It's
yeah, he said 2.5, right? Civilians for every
gotcha.
for every Hamas fighter. I think he means Hamas fighter, although, you know, who knows? He might be including civilian Hamas.
Yeah, the guy the janitor at the school, right? Like
yeah, exactly. It's just like those Nazi janitors in Germany.
Is that even a number to be proud of, though? I mean, like you take it at if we give them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's a number to be proud of. I think it's a horrifying number. I think if you're saying that you're killing well over twice the number of innocent people as enemy fighters, I mean, that's repulsive. But but also, as far as I could tell, it's just a completely made up number. I mean, I think they both found it, you know, somewhere up Dershowitz's ass. I don't know where the like, I don't know why we're supposed to believe that, or, you know, I mean, nobody's shown their homework in any way about it. And like when he says at the beginning, like one of the first things he said was that, oh, you know, we could have done this in 3 days, you know, if we didn't care about, you know, civilian life, which is insane because other than dropping, you know, like a bunch of nukes on Gaza, I don't know what he thinks they could have done in 3 days, but oh, we care so much about civilian lives. It's like, well, no, you can run some pretty obvious comparisons, right? So in you know, Russia invaded Ukraine in you know, just about exactly 2 years ago, and the Russian bombing campaign in Ukraine, I think, has very rightly been, you know, widely regarded as sort of reckless and in violation of, you know, laws of war and all of that stuff. And, in all of Ukraine, which needless to say is many, many times the population of Gaza. I think they've, I think estimates generally run around 10,000 or so, like civilians who've died in Ukraine. And we have tens of thousands, right? You have like
30,000 around. Yeah,
around 30,000. And, considering that this has been so indiscriminate that, so yeah, I mean, you have or certainly like the entire, in the last few months since October 7th, there have been many more civilians who've been killed in Gaza than were killed in Iraq in 2003. And again, Iraq, vastly bigger population than Gaza. So like all of the obvious points of comparison, it's like way, way, way more indiscriminate. And like also just the really obvious ground level fact that the number I keep going back to is just that, there are 2.3 million people who live in Gaza and 1.9 million of them have been displaced from their homes, right? I mean, it's like, are you really supposed to believe that this is like collateral damage that like, oh, we're just trying to kill the estimated, I mean, throw in civilian Hamas and who knows, but the estimated 30,000 members of military Hamas, right, in all of Gaza. You're just trying to go after those people, but we accidentally
displaced 95% of the population.
Yeah, that seems hard to do by accident.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some
certainly not if you're being careful.
I was doing some morbid math the other day, and I think the number to look at is the actual like death rate of all of Gaza, which is about 1.3%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but the death rate of World War II was about 3%, right? A much bigger war. I mean, if you imported that death rate or inflicted that death rate onto a country like the United States, that'd be over 4 million people. That'd be bigger than all of Los Angeles, just like wiped off the map. So that's the scale of how devastating a war this is to those people. When 1.3%, that's not even counting the tens of thousands of amputees and cripples and disabled people, and folks that are now suffering from famine and starvation. I mean, those numbers are going to go up, but it's unspeakably high.
Yeah, and World War II was several years, right? That's this is a few months. And yeah, because he did mention World War II before, and I think he was going to a bunch, in what follows. That I mean, just every time this comes up, I always feel the need to say it's like there is a reason. It should really set off some alarm bells that apologists for this keep on bringing up World War II as a precedent. That's like, oh, look, Dresden, whatever. It's like, well, which was widely criticized as a war crime on the Allied side at the time, and they actually pulled back from it, because it got so much backlash. But like, also, yeah, you're literally going back to before current international law was set. Convention.
We're about as half as bad as the most unspeakably bad time in modern human history, right? Yeah, okay. Victory.
Yeah, exactly.
No magic here. This whole thing could go away right now if Hamas lays down its arms and releases the hostages. We have really no choice. You had this army of radical Islamic zombies attacking Israel on October 7th, raping, severing heads, burning families because they were brainwashed with radical Islamic ideology. And they say they're going to do it again. So obviously, we really have no choice. And we're going to conduct this as far as we need. I also want to tell you something that is actually news. From our intelligence now, we know that prior to the October 7th attack, some of the Hamasniks asked the question, according to Sharia, you're not allowed to just murder people. So they asked, how can we do it? Hamas brought in clerics to give them a special fatwa that said, because you are Hamas warriors, you are allowed to murder civilians, women and children. You can go ahead and do that freely. This is what we're working against. And obviously we have to uproot all of Hamas until they're gone.
Right, but you've just admitted that you're killing Hamas civilians.
No, I said we're killing Hamas. And unfortunately, as in every war in history, there's also civilians that die because Hamas explicitly or deliberately hides behind the civilians in the most cowardly fashion. Notwithstanding that we're facing this incredible challenge, we're managing to do it at a much lower ratio of civilian
but you keep saying,
than in other wars.
Mr. Bennett, you keep saying that, but the bottom line is this. More Palestinians have been killed in 4 months than the total number of serving Ukrainians in the war against Russia, which has now entered its 3rd year. How can you say that this is, pro rata, one of the best executed wars in history, when you have that comparison of the 2 wars that are currently raging?
Well, you're comparing apples and oranges. Here, we're facing an enemy whose desire is to maximize not only the number of Israelis dead, but of their own civilians, precisely so Piers Morgan can ask me that question. It's a very cynical organization. We're not magicians. There's no magic here. If anyone has a better plan to submit, to tell us how to eradicate Hamas, bring it on. We'll go ahead and do it. Without that, short of that, we're going to have to pursue this. Just like Britain and America and the Soviet Union pursued Nazi Germany until total victory. We have to have total victory.
That comparison is not accurate in the sense that there's never been a conflict like this, a war like this, waged against a population where half of the population is under 18. I mean, that in itself makes this a very different type of war. That is why so many children are getting killed. That is why this collateral damage, as you call it, is almost uniquely horrific in Gaza, because half the population are children.
Well, as I said, if any country in the world would be willing to live next to Hamastan, that explicitly says right now that they're going to conduct more October 7th massacres again and again and again, if we don't eradicate them, then tell me who that is. Because again, we have absolutely no choice here but to win. And the best way to make this whole misery go away is to accelerate the pace of this victory and not tie Israel's hands behind our back. The longer it takes, the more losses there will be. We're being cautious about it, but I won't be reprimanded by anyone for defending my children, for defending my nation. I fought in wars. We hate war. Israelis do not like war. We didn't start this war. It came and hit us out of left field, and we were reminded that we're surrounded by the craziest terror organizations on earth. We didn't choose this. They started, they are continuing, and it can all go away if they lay down their arms. The only organization, the only people that are responsible for this is Hamas. And I also have to say, unfortunately, I would have loved to say that Hamas has hijacked the Palestinian population. But the facts are that Hamas won in democratic elections. Out of 132 seats, they won an absolute majority of 76 seats, and they were elected by their own people. That's the government that they chose, a government that attacked and did these heinous things and raped our daughters and burned families alive. People tend to forget that. This is not to say that we will go and deliberately hurt civilians, but unfortunately, after 20 years of brainwashing, many Palestinians support these sort of massacres. They say Jews are pigs, Jews are the Satan, we need to kill them.
If, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, you attack the Rafa refugee camp, there's 1.6 million people there who've gone there because they were told to go there by Israel. If that is attacked in the way you've been attacking the north of Gaza, it's going to be absolutely horrific in terms of the death toll. And again, it will be largely innocent children and women. We know that from the comparative figures of Hamas terrorists who've been killed to innocent civilians. How could you justify attacking a massive refugee camp?
No, first we're going to move them away from that camp. We're going to allow for ample time for the civilians to move away, much as we did.
Where do they go?
They're going to go. There's an area between Gaza City and Khan Yunis that can allocate them. Look, this isn't fun. This isn't something we want to do, but we have to uproot Hamas for everyone's benefit, including the citizens of Gaza. You know, when I see the Palestinians celebrating this, you know, do you know that 70% of the Palestinians in the latest poll support this massacre? It's unbelievable. You know, in the over 100 years of conflict, they call this their biggest achievement. While we were building a country, a nation for the Jewish people, and bringing deserts back to life here in Israel, their biggest achievement, in their own words, is raping women and burning families. Is that what you're proud about? I asked them.
The other area of concern about what Israel's doing or not doing is the amount of aid that's getting in there. All the official bodies are in agreement that not enough aid is getting through, despite what Israel keeps saying. What is happening on that front? Because there are many, many people now who are dying as a consequence not of bombs, but of malnutrition, of dehydration, of just not getting basic stuff to survive on.
So Israel is allowing as much aid and civilian aid as necessary. What we don't want is that within that aid, they will smuggle arms and ammunition. And it is complicated. As I said, you know, all the questions are always towards Israel, as if we're the perpetrators of all of this. But it's Hamas who started and is continuing all of this. They can make it go away right now. It's not going to be, you know, a bed of roses. It's tough. It's a very complicated situation. But I'm proud to be Israeli. I'm proud that we are managing this in the most responsible way under international criticism that is growing and is unfair and is wrong. But it is what it is, and we're going to see this through.
I mean, Brazil's President Lula last week called out Israel, said that Israel was responsible for the genocide of the Palestinian people. What's your response to him?
He's an idiot.
That's it?
That's it. What can I say? Look, I want to tell you something. You know, I hear this criticism, and it's simply Israel hate, Jewish hate. There's no explanation for someone who can talk about genocide. There's no genocide whatsoever. The only genocide that was attempted is when they came in on October 7th to explicitly murder women and children. That is an attempt for genocide. The only reason it stopped is because of the Israeli army. We're going in and doing everything, bending over backward to defend and avoid unnecessary deaths. We're losing boys fighting there because we are so cautious. So anyone who says that is simply a hypocrite, and worse than that.
So one interesting thing about that last claim is that I believe the sort of the number for October 7th that I've seen, I don't know if this is the current number or not. I know it gets adjusted later, you know, as more information comes in. But the number I remember seeing a lot was that about 1,200 Israelis died on October 7th. And last night, actually, I was working on an article for Jacobin about the New York Times coverage of Gaza. And so I looked it up. As you know, I mean, I don't think I directly used it in the article, but I looked it up because I wanted to, you know, I was thinking about mentioning it at one point. And I think it said the estimate is about 695 of the Israeli deaths on October 7th were civilians. So if, you know, look, I also don't know how much of that is friendly fire. And I'm not saying that from a perspective of you know, I think there's like a certain kind of 10-7 trutherism on parts of the left that's super unhelpful and definitely not accurate, right? Like there's no doubt whatsoever that there are plenty of civilians who were intentionally killed or captured, by Hamas on October 7th. But but we do know that there was like some pretty heavy duty friendly fire going on also, right? So I just don't know, right? But if you assume for the sake of argument that's 0% friendly fire, that's 100% Hamas. What Naftali Bennett is calling attempted genocide is a way better rate of soldiers to civilians than his own completely made up estimate about Israel's campaign in Gaza since then.
That's a very good point. I never even thought about it that way. But even if we were to grant him, let's say that it was all civilians, no IDF soldiers, no security were killed, and it was just straight up bloodthirsty kill the Jewish people. It wouldn't justify the kind of collective punishment that the Israelis are inflicting upon Gaza. And I think it was Sean Moon in the chat that said it was collective punishment. And that's what you hear through this whole kind of angry screed, this angry sort of bloodthirsty screed in which he's basically characterizing Palestinians as brainwashed zombies whose number one achievement, proudest thing they've ever done as a civilization is attack Israel, and he just wants to grind them into dust. I mean, it's kind of difficult to debate this sort of thing because there's not really much to debate. I mean, there are obviously a bunch of stats and figures that are sort of being made up whole cloth out of his sort of mind palace, and we can kind of like we can and we should get into those kinds of things, but really the debate is really about when he says, I'm proud to be a Jew and I'm going to go and I'm going to attack them, these like people that are worthless. And so I think, but it is refreshing to hear it sort of stated plainly and stated clearly, at least. Then we know what we're kind of up against.
Yeah, no, exactly. I would actually prefer to have, that level of honesty, I suppose, than, that people, pretending, like while they're still supporting the same things.
Yeah, I remember once, just a little side note, I was friends with some Zionists on campus when I was a little student activist, and I had this one sort of like far right friend that I like kind of sparring with, and he was the most hateful kind of Islamophobe, and he was like on the right of the kind of mainstream Zionist groups on my campus, and they were handing out condoms and like making challah bread and like doing sort of like cultural pink washing and propaganda, and he would always argue them and be like, it's not about that, it's about oppressing the Palestinians, like we need to get our message straight here. Like, you're right.
Yeah. Jesus. Yeah, no, this is, it's also funny, he said the thing about, Hamas, clerics justifying atrocities against civilians. And I saw speculation in the chat about whether that's true. It's like, look, sure. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I mean, that doesn't sound like implausible at all to me, right? Like that could very well be true. Lots of things happen like that, in lots of different contexts, where you have especially, extreme theocratic groups. But it's also a really, just kind of irony deflector accusation to make, given the kind of thing that we've seen from prominent Israeli rabbis along similar lines, given things that you've seen from the Prime Minister of Israel, right, Benjamin Netanyahu, who like right at the outset of the war, compared Hamas to Amalek, right, which is a apparent reference to the biblical commandment to wipe out Amalek, not just the soldiers, but also the, you know, the women and the children, the suckling babes, right? That's
or Gallant referring to Palestinians as human animals.
Yeah, I would. Oh my God, there's been so much of that. Yeah, which is one of the. In fact, this is the that New York Times story I was talking about. A lot of it was about you know, the Anat Schwartz. You probably know this. The who in was the Israeli freelancer who was one of three people who worked on the New York Times's whose byline appeared in the New York Times's Screams Without Words, like their big prominent story about sexual assault on October 7th, which I should say, look, I don't doubt that, you know, I mean, I would actually be shocked if there were no genuine examples of sexual assault on October 7th. I think everything we know about the history of war would make it incredibly unlikely that there were zero examples of that. But this particular story made a lot of dubious claims that, you know, have been, you know, that, like, you know, the evidence since then hasn't been kind to, and it's more recently come out that so the three bylines in the story, one of them was, you know, one of them was like a more respected New York Times reporter, but the then second one was Anat Schwartz, who is a former Israeli Air Force intelligence officer with no apparent relevant journalistic background, and the third one was her nephew. And then, like, the recent twist in the last few days is that it came out that she'd liked this Twitter post that referred to, you know, Palestinians as human animals and talked about turning Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Right? There's been tons of stuff like that, right, on the Israeli side, right? So it's like, I don't. Yeah, sure. I mean, lots of people lots of clerics are willing to make religious excuses for, you know, killing people. Lots of politicians are willing to, you know, sort of invoke religious, you know, arguments for it. You know, I happens all over the place, right? But, like, I you know, it's particularly concerning to me when it happens in Israel, not just because, you know, I feel an uncomfortable sense of, you know, cultural connection, but also because that's, you know, I mean, he said it, one of the last things that he said before we paused was like, oh, why are people always asking these questions about Israel, right? You know, why aren't you asking about Hamas? It's like, well, because my country isn't sending billions of dollars to Hamas. Yeah. And, you know, Russian weapons shipments to Hamas, and, you know, my politicians aren't, like, tripping over each other to, like, express their undying loyalty to Hamas, right? So, like, if they were, I would have a problem with that, but that's not the situation. So, given that I, you know, I really don't have a line of contact to, you know, to Hamas, right? So I don't know how exactly I'm supposed to bring my complaints to them, right? But given that the perpetrator of far larger scale atrocities is being armed and funded and praised and defended and given diplomatic cover by my government, then, like, yeah, that just, you know, seems like there are some pretty straightforward reasons why that would be a higher priority issue for me.
Yeah, I remember during college, when I was more involved in Palestinian activism on the ground, all the Zionists on campus would always bring up, like, Sudan and Darfur, and say, like, well, why aren't you worried about this thing? And I'm like, well, what exactly does that have to do with the policies of my government? Like, you know, like, and also it's not either or. I mean, we can care about a lot of things. I don't really think that there is, like, a unique fixation on Israel, except, I mean, it's certainly not a disproportionate one. I think, given the scale of the military aid, like, to your point, Ben, it's entirely reasonable.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, if the United States or Canada had been backing, you know, the genocide in Darfur, then, you know, I would imagine, you know, like, you know, that would be a higher priority issue for Americans and Canadians. And it's also like a lot of times when I hear this stuff, it's like, yeah, I have this is the I think people who say things like this don't quite seem to understand what a protest is. Right? That they sort of think that like when people are protesting things, what they're doing is they're just like randomly yelling about anything bad that anybody anywhere is doing. Right? It's like, no, like a protest is something that you do because you object to and want to change the policies of your government. Right? Like it doesn't really, I'm not going to like do a, it's like what they're talking about is just sort of people, venting how displeasing they find something that they have no connection to. Right?
Wait, I mean, you organize around things you care about and feel morally implicated in, and not just go on Wikipedia and find list of like top 10 cause of death in the world, and then allocate your protest time based on the ratio of thing. You go, okay, so cancer is like the #1 killer, so I'm going to be 40% mad about that all the time, and then and then diabetes is 7%, so I'm going to spend 7% of my protest time lobbying my health minister, and then car accidents are 3%, and so that's going to be 3% of my politics.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's like, you're not going to be a utility bot about it anyway, and it's silly to think that anybody would be, right? And it's like oftentimes the why are you so obsessed with with Israel people are the same people who are absolutely obsessed with defending Israel.
Yeah, that's true.
But like it's also, it's like, so yeah, like I think in a lot of these cases, like, yeah, I'm not, I mean, I think protesting actions by enemies of my government that, like that I'm, that like my government isn't supported in any way, I think is about as good a use of anybody's time as protesting, atrocities that were committed in past centuries. But also in some cases, at best, people who are doing all this rampant whataboutism can find like things that would make sense to protest that get less attention. And it's like, if that's the case, okay, great. But does that mean we should pay less attention to the horrors in Gaza, or does it mean we should pay more attention to that? Because it seems like you're not really trying to get me to pay more attention to that other thing. You're really trying to get me to talk less about this.
I'm with HG in the chat that we should just protest old age. That really is the #1 killer. So
that's true. That's true. Until we solve that, right? There's that Norm Macdonald bit about that, right? He's like talking about, oh yeah, I hear the politicians talking about the problem, but all the problems, but like #1's got to be death, right? I mean, that's the big problem.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'll also tell you one more thing.
Mr. Bennett,
I want to say.
Well, I just want to say that the problem with the kind of blanket, this is obviously ridiculous, is when you look at the numbers, 1,200 Israelis died on October the 7th. 5,431 more were injured. And 233 IDF soldiers have been killed in Gaza, with 1,373 injured. But in the response against the Palestinians in Gaza, nearly 30,000 Palestinians now killed, 69,000 more injured. So this is 30 times as many Palestinians have already been killed in response. And you've indicated this could go on for many more months. So these numbers could double, potentially. They could triple. Who knows how long it'll take for you to finish this war? You may end up where you've killed 50, 60, 70 times as many Palestinians as Israelis who died on October the 7th. How can that be right?
Wars and this sort of situation, which is not really a war because it started by a heinous terror attack that was totally out of the blue. They were actually going through a period of prosperity, relative prosperity and growth in Gaza, yet they perpetrated this. It's never about comparing numbers. When did we start comparing numbers? Do you want to compare how many Americans died in World War II versus Nazi Germany? Is that the comparison? Is America in the wrong because more Nazis died than Americans?
Well, again, I would again say that in relation to that comparison, the particular nature of this war which is so concerning to people, is the massively high percentage of the Gazan population, which is children. And that did not happen in World War II. Those numbers were not anything like the same. So there's no direct comparison to be made. You're basically waging war on a very small area of land, densely populated by 50% children. And in the process, you're killing thousands and thousands of children and will continue to do so. And that is why the international community, even those who, like me, say, I think you have a right and a duty to defend yourself. And clearly, if Hamas is wedded to doing more of these, you must try and get rid of them. But there must come a point, even for Israel, even for people like yourself, where you look at the sheer numbers of children being killed and you stop and pause and think, is this actually the right way to prosecute this war?
Piers, I'd rather be unpopular and alive than beloved and dead. And if the world doesn't have sympathy for us when we're fighting for our lives, because it's not only Hamas and Hezbollah, so be it. We're just going to have to do what we need to do. And I can guarantee that more Nazi children and German children died in World War II than in Gaza.
Not as a percentage of those who died. That's the point. Let me ask you.
Look, I'm not in a math class right now. I'm in the real world.
To be fair, you were the one. You were the one that was actually. You wanted me to. You wanted to make the comparison. I'm simply saying the comparison is not a valid one for that specific reason.
It's exactly a valid one. I fully disagree. It's exactly a valid one because you had a regime that was from foot to head embroiled in radical Nazi ideology and in murdering Jews. You have the same regime in Gaza that enjoys full popular support. Unfortunately, almost every home in Gaza, I spoke to soldiers for the past several months. They come out and they say almost every home in Gaza has arms, has grenades, has rifles, has RPGs within the home. They've turned all of Gaza into a massive military.
If that's true, it's very surprising that those don't seem to be showing up on all those charming Israeli TikToks of soldiers ransacking homes. Why aren't they showing us the grenades, right? Why are they showing us like the underwear drawer and, making fun of, making fun of the house? Like, why is it like, oh, holy shit, look, we've just found some grenades.
Yeah, look at this calendar. That's like the extent of the kinds of things that they show. Now, I'm just a humble podcaster and I'm not very good at math, but I'm looking at the death rate, even in Germany, which was of just civilians, 350 to 400,000, which is, an unspeakably high number, but of a population of 70 million, which is about 0.5%. Is that right?
That sounds right. Yeah. I like
0.6.
It's also really funny that he doesn't say that he, that like his response to essentially, his response to a request to think about the morality of killing massive numbers of children was, oh, you're just asking about what we're doing being unpopular. Wow. And then he said that, it's not a math class. It's like, well, hold on. It was a math class a minute ago when you said that what Israel was doing was fine because the made up number in your head was only 2.5 civilians for every member of the military who was killed, rather than 6 or 7. So it's like this is the when it is and it isn't a math class seems to vary wildly. And yeah, it's also so what was actually hold on, now I'm curious. So
the population Germany was 69 million, and the civilian deaths were between 353 to 410,000.
Yeah, well, okay, so how many which also, by the way, so yeah, I'm looking at, I think, the same thing, right? So estimates of German civilians killed by only by Allied bombing.
Yeah.
Strategic bombing. Yeah, we're looking at the same thing of range for about 350,000 to 500,000. And just out of curiosity, I looked up German military deaths during World War II, and that's about 5.5 million, right? So
ratio's
in in World War II, there are about 11. So 500,000. So yeah, so there are about 11 German soldiers who were killed for every German civilian, and that's the precedent that he wants to bring up to justify this, to justify what he claims, based on numbers he made up in his head, are only 2.5 civilians killed for every Hamas fighter. And again, even that 350 to 500,000 compared to 5.5 million soldiers, like even that involves things that were widely considered even at the time, like were extremely controversial, like even at the time on the Allied side, in the press in Allied countries, like the bombing of Dresden, and that were considered to be like, that's why we got the Second Geneva Conventions, because this was considered to be such a horrifying war. We're just never going to fight a war that way again.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to compare yourself to. It's not something I think that I'd be particularly proud of, these kinds of numbers. But you're right. I mean,
anybody who read their Kurt Vonnegut, right? I mean, you'd have a sense that something very bad happened with Dresden, and you wouldn't want to like bring that up in your defense, that what you were doing was only about that bad.
Yeah, exactly. And Silver Harlow in the chat, and you made the same point too, Ben, where it's like at some points it's a math class. He's bringing up 3,000 soldiers here and 2 to 1 there. And then when we actually start checking the math, and Piers does, it's like, oh, whoa, this isn't a math class. This is about, what's right and wrong. Well, it's like, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Terror base, and they are paying for that. It's their responsibility.
Let me ask you,
all these questions that you're lobbying towards me, you should be lobbying towards Hamas and Hamas only. I know that you are actually on the much more balanced and fair side, but I'm focused on international criticism. Go to Hamas and ask them. Go to Iran and ask Iran, why are they funding this sort of genocidal attempts?
Let me ask you about the reports of a potential new ceasefire, this meeting in Paris, now moving to Qatar. What do you know about that? And how likely is it that we will get another ceasefire? And what would it look like?
Well, I'd give it about a 50% chance at this moment in time. We're talking about release of several dozen hostages that are held by Hamas captives. And in return, we're going to, unfortunately, have to release terrorists that are in jail in a reasonable ratio that the government is trying to achieve. And there will be a temporary ceasefire of a ballpark of a month and a half, after which we will continue and finish Hamas' last stronghold in Rafa, and hopefully eradicate Hamas, and then begin the process of allowing Gaza to recover and rebuild.
Final question. The Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority has resigned. Many people in Israel, the vast majority, actually think that Prime Minister Netanyahu should also leave his job as a result of what happened on October the 7th. You were his former chief of staff. Do you think he should step aside and we have completely new leadership on both sides here?
There's going to be a time for everything. While we've been political rivals for many years, Prime Minister Netanyahu and myself, I'm not going to criticize him on international media. Certainly not during war.
But his plan, finally, is that basically Israel will continue with a more restrictive occupation of Gaza than it was doing before October the 7th. How, given the long history of this conflict, how would you think that that would do anything other than stir up more radicalization against Israel?
No, that's not the plan. The plan is to have a security umbrella and ultimately allow the Gazans to govern themselves. The two guiding stars from our perspective are A, to retain full Israeli security, and B, we don't want to govern them. Israel doesn't have any desire to govern or re-enter or live in Gaza. So it's purely on security grounds that we're going to make our decisions. And it's complicated because it's going to take several years to denazify Gaza from the brainwash that these people have gone through for many, many years. It takes time because they are convinced that all Jews are the Satan and need to be murdered. Otherwise, they wouldn't do those crazy stuff they did on October 7th.
Naftali Bennett, former Prime Minister of Israel, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Piers.
Oh, good Lord. That is really amazing. You'd said at the outset that this is something, I think we were already on air when you said this, that you'd seen a lot of, right-wing media was very excited about this debate that, said that, Bennett really told Piers what was what. And what did he tell him? Right. We had some pretty standard talking points that everybody's heard a million times before. Then there was, then he, he was asked point blank a bunch of questions about the morality of killing thousands and thousands of children at a far greater rate than in any other comparable conflict around the world. And he said, I'm not in a math class. And then he said, we're not going to be occupying Gaza. It's just a security umbrella while we denazify it. It's I really would have liked some follow-up on there to explain exactly what the difference is between that and an occupation.
Yeah, I don't know how to say. Are we supposed to analyze sort of who won? Because I don't see in what way Piers Morgan was schooled or educated in caps lock, and that certainly is not what happened. And Morgan pressed him and pushed back on some things, but it was mostly how do you feel comfortable with how the war has been prosecuted? Is this number of civilian deaths okay? And then he just says we're just going to do whatever it takes to achieve our objectives, and we have no other choice. I mean, if anything, he just kind of gave him the space to lay out his odious screed. There wasn't much of a debate at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's, and I suppose there is, there's always a little bit of a value to the signed confession, right? To being asked point blank about whether he's comfortable with with killing massive numbers of Gazan children, and hearing him say yes. But yeah, it is really, was, I think, also a pretty low energy performance by Piers Morgan, as the former president would say, right? I think Silver said that. Somebody said that in the chat.
Yeah.
That's, RXT. Sorry. RXT said that in the chat. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a strange, it's a strange and unsatisfying exchange because Piers is already drinking so much of the Kool-Aid at the outset of all this, right? That, certainly about conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, like we talked about before, certainly about the idea that, the idea that Israel was just sort of minding its collective business, and, the October 7th attacks came out of nowhere. And so, of course, they have to retaliate when, it's, without obviously justifying the October 7th attacks. It's nevertheless the case that, that there's a long chain of events that, attacks and counterattacks that this is taking place in, right? That this is that's the totally absurd part of Bennett's argument that Piers was just granting the entire time, right? Wasn't questioning at all. is, oh, look, they started this, when, of course, you know, Israel had been keeping Gaza under this absolutely brutal blockade for decades. There were many, you know, mowings of the lawn over the decades since then. That, you know, I mean, Hamas itself said that that the attack, you know, in their official statements about it, that, you know, part of what the attack was in retaliation for were the, you know, settler pogroms against Palestinians on the West Bank, which had been happening at an unprecedented rate in 2023 before October 7th, that there was an area that's about 10% of the West Bank that had been mostly cleared of Palestinian population. So, like, all of that just sort of the idea that that, you know, Israel was just sort of living in peace with Palestinians, you know, before October 7th, when they were attacked for no reason, is just this giant absurdity that Piers was granting just right out the gate, right? No pushback whatsoever on that, you know, that entire premise, right? Or talking about Gaza as if it was this independent country rather than occupied in various forms by Israel since 1967. And that, you know, Israel, since the disengagement, had been maintaining very tight, you know, control over the land, air, and sea borders. You know, Gaza, you know, bombing it periodically, you know, controlling everything that went in and out, et cetera, right? Like, so yeah, all of that's incredibly frustrating. But I think within the sort of super narrow parameters of disagreement, which are basically just, is Netanyahu too much of an extremist? And has Israel, in what they're both assuming is an essentially justified war, has Israel gone too far, and is it being too callous about civilian deaths, right? Those are the parameters of debate. And within those extremely narrow parameters, I'm not going to say that Piers Morgan did a good job, because I don't think he did, but I think he maybe did something that was useful in sort of channeling a lot of the kind of obvious what any normal person would think when they were listening to some of what Bennett was saying, and just showing, you know, if you go with the old Elizabeth Bruenig thing about how half the point of a debate is to get the other person to tell you what you know, say what they really think, right? Like, on those grounds, I do see some value here.
Yeah, I co-sign everything that you just said there. That's all very well said. And I do think the reason why he was sort of low energy is because, like, what were the stakes exactly of this debate for Morgan? Like, it struck me, I think it was the second or third question. Bennett talked about, you know, wanting to completely eradicate Hamas. And Piers retorted with a question about, I can't remember exactly the way he said that, but he said something to the effect of, well, how could you do that, really? Like, aren't you just going to continue this thing and, like, create more hatred, which is going to be worse for you? And I wrote to myself that basically his question was saying, like, it's not in your interest to prosecute the war in the way that you're doing. Which, you know, you can read two ways, right? In a debate, sometimes you try and, like, you know, put things in the terms of the interest of your opponent to maybe get them to side with you in a kind of cynical way. But it also might mean that they ultimately do have the same interests. And it's Piers Morgan that just thinks, like, the more sort of, like, sensible way to prosecute this occupation wouldn't involve this kind of war, but the occupation itself and the underlying politics aren't much of a problem to him. Now, I don't know. I don't want to say that necessarily, because I haven't followed, you know, everything he said about Israel-Palestine, but it did feel like there was some kind of, you know, deep, unquestioned assumptions there, and maybe things that were shared in common. And then my sort of last takeaway was, I feel like there was, I mean, I haven't followed it very, very closely, but from my understanding, there's a wide degree of debate about what the post-invasion Gaza situation is going to be. There's hard right members that do actually want full-scale resettlement. It seems like Netanyahu wants, like, some sort of perimeter wall that's going to take out a bunch of land. It seems like the U.S. wants a Fatah-administered Gaza, you know, Israel doesn't want that. And like from my reading, it's like they don't really have much of a plan. I think that the plan is being debated. So to ask sort of one question and then have him say, what was the phrase he used? Oh, we're just going to have, the Palestinians, rule themselves and we'll secure our security. I mean, what exactly did that mean? And to have no pushback on what is a really big kind of open question in my mind, that was a little disappointing, I think.
Well, especially because he's classifying any Palestinian with any administrative experience at any level of Gazan society since 2005 as civilian Hamas.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So you say like, but regardless, I mean, it's very clear that what you're talking about is any sort of Palestinians who are allowed to run anything in Gaza after the end of the war are going to be Palestinians who are appointed by Israel, right? Which is how occupations work. Like that the locals who are given any sort of authority, it's delegated by the occupying power. And that's just, so yeah, I mean, he's clearly describing an occupation. But yeah, so that's right. So there have been various plans that have been floated from hard right cabinet ministers, some pretty important, high level cabinet ministers that would involve full scale resettlement, and Netanyahu has at times flirted with that. He's made references to negotiate, like talks with other countries to see, Gazans they would take in, right? So, presumably if that happened, the way, couldn't just sort of say, oh, all Palestinians have to leave Gaza now. It would be, in order to sort of maintain Israel's relationship with the United States and other countries, presumably the way it would be done would be, you just make people put people in such horrifying conditions that you think they're going to be willing to accept resettlement, and you frame it as humanitarian when you do it. But, I guess the question is, I know they put out this one-page plan, said, oh, we'll find some Palestinians and they can administer some stuff. And we're going to do security, all of which is just a sort of strange way of saying what everybody would already understand by the phrase military occupation, right? Yeah. That's that you're providing security, and then people who are locals who you appoint, right, are running things, like every occupation ever. Yeah. But yeah, I would just suggest is, to a certain extent, you have to infer intent from actions here. And, even if Netanyahu himself hasn't quite come out and endorsed, the plans that have been floated, by these ministers who, have certainly not been kicked out of the cabinet for floating them, right? That's considered perfectly acceptable. But even if he hasn't himself explicitly embraced that, does it seem like the overall thrust of Israel's actions in Gaza is in the direction of having life go on as usual for most residents of Gaza? And it really doesn't seem like it, right? That they're 85% of people have already been internally displaced. There's been this systematic destruction of regular civilian infrastructure. I mean, to the point that, one of the examples I keep coming back to because it's so striking that the last university that was standing in Gaza was destroyed not by aerial bombing but by controlled demolition, right? All of this strongly suggests to me that the end game isn't to just have, we're gonna swap out the administrators, but basically life is going to continue as is. That the point is that you're going to at least aim to get a large percentage of the population to accept, voluntary resettlement. Otherwise none of this really makes sense. I mean, I kind of think the two options are either that is the intention, or that they're just really flying in the dark and just have no idea what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, like my kind of hunch is that it's the latter. Like they're just, I mean, especially with Netanyahu. I mean, he's, if not for the war, I mean, Piers Morgan was right to sort of bring it up. Like, you know, a lot of people want him sacked, including his hard ultra right flank that wants to resettle Gaza. And has he been able to say no to anything that they've asked for? Ultimately, like, can he ultimately, like, they'll hold the balance of power. He could lose his position. He could end up in prison. So I don't know how he's going to, like, you know, pump the brakes on these folks, and he wouldn't want to anyway. So yeah, it seems like things are going in a terrible place, and for Netanyahu's political career, the war itself might be the last chapter. So he's just going to probably hold on to it as long as he can hold on to it.
Right. Yeah, that seems exactly right. And so, yeah, even if you do assume that there's no intention of mass resettlement on Netanyahu's part, that does still seem like the logic of the situation. That you know, it's certainly the intention of plenty of people who are important coalition partners, and it's not obvious that he could afford to completely ignore them. So, you know, this is, if there's no sort of clear countervailing vision of what's going to happen, and there are people pushing in that direction, and even if you think is just kind of flying in the dark, right, that it's like, well, you know, you're going to go, I don't know, if we change it from flying in the dark to rowing in the dark, and, like, you know, some of the oars are rowing in a very specific direction and some of them are just flailing around at random, right, then that seems to suggest that that's where the ship is going to go. But we will see. I hear that Biden is increasingly frustrated, which apparently is.
Yeah, how many times has he given them a stern talking to over the phone? I don't know.
Yeah. No, this could escalate to an email with, you know, some words in all caps, you know, if Netanyahu isn't careful. I mean, we'll still send guns and money, obviously. But.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thank you so much, Gordon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, always, you know, top 5 Canadian. So I'll talk to you soon. Left is best.